Every pilot trains for years, believing that one day skill and preparation will defeat disaster. But sometimes, fate strikes when preparation is missing, and that is when small mistakes turn fatal. On 6 March 2003, an Air Algérie Boeing 737-200 was scheduled to operate a short domestic route. The plan was simple: depart from Tamanrasset, stop briefly in Gardaya, then continue to Algiers. The crew included 2 pilots and 4 cabin crew members. The aircraft, nearly 20 years old, had been maintained according to regulations and showed no open technical faults. However, the flight was delayed almost 3 hours due to a problem with the hydraulic system pump. Though the issue was eventually resolved, the delay would quietly create new risks. Because of this delay, the captain arrived late and missed the full crew briefing. The first officer, a highly experienced pilot with over 5,000 flight hours, was forced to complete most pre-flight preparations alone. She checked weather, fuel, and performance data while the temperature continued to rise. Tamanrasset Airport sits at a high elevation, and combined with the afternoon heat, aircraft performance would already be reduced. High temperature and altitude mean thinner air, less lift, and less engine power. This requires higher takeoff speeds and longer runway distance, especially for heavy aircraft. Despite this, the aircraft was fueled close to its maximum takeoff weight, carrying 97 passengers and nearly 10 tons of fuel. The first officer calculated the required takeoff speeds and noted they were unusually high, a warning sign of limited performance margins. When the captain finally arrived, he agreed that the first officer would fly the first leg. However, instead of assisting with preparations, he became distracted by casual conversation, a decision that would soon prove deadly. As the first officer continued final checks, the captain's attention drifted to chatting with the purser, leaving cockpit procedures incomplete. The purser, unusually, stayed in the cockpit rather than his jump seat, violating standard safety practices. In a Boeing 737, every crew member has a clear role for emergencies, especially during takeoff, when every second counts. The passengers boarded, and among them was a 28-year-old conscript seated at the very back near the aft galley. He ignored the safety briefing and didn't fasten his seat belt, a decision that, unknowingly, would later save his life. 3 passengers couldn't board due to documentation issues, leaving 97 on board. Meanwhile, the first officer reviewed the load sheet and noticed errors, including discrepancies in fuel weight and passenger count. She corrected them and calculated takeoff speeds. V1 at 144 knots, VR at 146 knots, and V2 at 150 knots. She also briefed the captain that full thrust would be required, using an EPR of 2.18 due to high-density altitude and heavy weight. However, the captain ignored most of the briefing, brushing off critical steps like engine failure procedures specific to Tamanrasset Airport. Normally, pilots rehearse emergency steps before departure, mentally preparing for engine failure scenarios. This briefing is vital for crew coordination, yet it was skipped. By 14:08, the aircraft completed pushback and startup. Weather was calm with a slight crosswind. As the plane taxied to the runway, the first officer tried to enforce procedures, but the captain and purser were distracted by personal conversation, further reducing situational awareness. Unbeknownst to everyone, internal damage had already begun in the left engine. Small cracks in the high-pressure turbine, caused by years of thermal stress, were hidden under residue from oil breakdown. These cracks would soon become critical. The aircraft lined up for runway 02, fully loaded and ready to take off. The stage was set, but the crew was unprepared for the disaster about to strike. At 14:12, the Boeing 737 lined up on runway 02. The first officer called out the standard checks, flaps set, brakes released, and thrust levers at takeoff power. Engines roared, the aircraft accelerated, and all seemed normal. The captain's focus, however, remained on his conversation rather than monitoring the takeoff. By the time the aircraft reached V1 and rotation speeds, the first officer smoothly lifted the nose, initiating takeoff at about 160 knots. She called for the landing gear to be retracted, but at the same moment, disaster struck. Inside the left engine, the high-pressure turbine blades fractured suddenly. Thermal fatigue and hidden cracks caused the engine to lose thrust instantly. The second stage turbine blades were damaged by the debris and overheated from the redirected hot airflow. Within seconds, the left engine was effectively dead. The aircraft yawed 12 degrees to the left due to asymmetric thrust. Trained pilots would respond immediately with rudder input and proper climb attitude. The first officer reacted correctly, pushing right rudder and maintaining control. She attempted to retract the landing gear, but the captain, startled by the loud bang and sudden yaw, did not respond. Instead, the captain grabbed the controls from the first officer, despite not knowing the exact nature of the problem. The aircraft, fully loaded, now had one engine out, the gear extended, and the remaining engine's thrust reduced, a recipe for a stall. Normally, the pilot flying focuses solely on keeping the aircraft stable while the other pilot performs emergency checklists. Here, no proper handover occurred. The first officer was momentarily sidelined, unsure if she should intervene, monitor instruments, or communicate with air traffic control. Within seconds, the aircraft climbed only to 390 feet, speed dropped dangerously, and the stick shaker activated, warning of an imminent stall. With the stick shaker vibrating continuously, the Boeing 737 was now in critical danger. The captain, still holding the controls, continued pitching up to the normal takeoff angle of 18 degrees, unaware that this attitude was unsustainable with one engine out, gear extended, and reduced thrust on the right engine. The first officer, now sidelined but aware of the aircraft's deteriorating condition, tried to communicate. She reminded the captain about retracting the landing gear and called out speed readings. The captain, lightly overwhelmed and startled, ignored all inputs. At this point, the aircraft was losing speed rapidly. The correct climb speed after an engine failure, with gear retracted, would have allowed a climb rate of around 450 feet per minute. With the gear still down, the aircraft could only manage a fraction of that. Warnings from the GPWS system blared, shouting, "Don't sink." The right wing began to drop, a clear sign the plane was nearing a full stall. The first officer, trained for emergencies, attempted to regain situational awareness while the captain struggled to understand the failure. Meanwhile, the tower controller, watching the aircraft yaw and struggle on radar, recognized the imminent danger. Airport firefighters were immediately alerted and rushed to the runway in anticipation of a crash. Inside the cabin, passengers were unaware of the unfolding catastrophe. Among them, the 28-year-old conscript remained unbelted, relaxing in his seat at the back, a decision that unknowingly set him apart from the others who were trapped by the crash sequence about to occur. In these tense seconds, the combination of poor cockpit discipline, lack of crew resource management, and a mechanical failure left the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. Every critical second was lost in indecision and distraction. Seconds after the engine failure, the Boeing 737's situation worsened rapidly. Speed continued to drop as the aircraft climbed only minimally, despite the captain holding a full nose-up attitude. The stick shaker's warning persisted, signaling that the plane was moments from a full aerodynamic stall. The first officer attempted one last time to regain control. She suggested retracting the landing gear and monitored instruments closely, but the captain, still unaware of the severity of the situation, ignored all corrective actions. Communication between the two pilots had broken down completely. At 14:15, the aircraft reached its maximum altitude of just 390 feet. With the right wing dropping and speed dangerously low, there was no longer sufficient lift to maintain controlled flight. The GPWS warnings echoed inside the cockpit, but the pilots were too overwhelmed to respond effectively. Outside, the tower had already sounded the emergency alarm, alerting fire crews to the impending disaster. Emergency vehicles raced toward the runway, but the distance left to impact was minimal. In the cabin, passengers remained largely unaware of the true danger, except for those who could feel the unnatural angle and turbulence. The unbelted conscript at the rear, surprisingly, was ejected from his seat during the upcoming impact sequence, unknowingly increasing his chance of survival. The aircraft, fully loaded and underpowered on one engine, was descending rapidly. Standard emergency procedures for engine failure on takeoff had not been properly executed. The combination of extended landing gear, wrong pitch angle, and reduced thrust made it impossible for the plane to recover. In less than a minute after liftoff, the flight transitioned from a standard takeoff into a catastrophic emergency, with the crew struggling to understand a situation that had escalated faster than anyone could manage. At 14 hours 15 minutes and 18 seconds, Air Algérie Flight 60-89 crashed just beyond the end of runway 02. The right wing and tail struck the ground first, causing the aircraft to break apart almost immediately. The plane slid across the runway, broke through the airport perimeter fence, and even crossed a nearby road. The fuselage wings ignited, creating a massive fireball that engulfed most of the fuselage. Fire crews, who had rushed to the scene, were too late to prevent the destruction. Within moments, the aircraft was largely consumed by flames. Of the 97 passengers and 6 crew members, 102 perished instantly. Only one person survived, the 28-year-old conscript at the back. Because he had not fastened his seat belt, he was ejected from the aircraft during the breakup. He suffered serious injuries and was in a coma for several days before waking. His unbuckled seat had, ironically, saved his life. The other 3 passengers who missed the flight due to document issues were also spared, an unbelievable twist of fate. For them and the lone survivor, luck played an undeniable role in survival. Investigators later determined that the crash was the result of a catastrophic engine failure during takeoff, combined with the captain's improper handling of the aircraft. Contributing factors included failure to retract the landing gear, inadequate cockpit resource management, and the captain taking control without fully assessing the problem. This disaster highlights the importance of pre-flight preparation, strict adherence to standard operating procedures, and maintaining focus during critical phases of flight. Even highly experienced crews can fail when procedures are ignored or ignored under pressure. After the crash, Investigators from Algeria and international aviation authorities began piecing together the events leading to the disaster. The flight data and cockpit voice recorders revealed a series of mistakes and missteps. First, the engine failure was traced back to the left engine's high-pressure turbine blades, which had fractured due to thermal fatigue. Years of stress had created tiny cracks, hidden beneath residue from engine oil breakdown. While the aircraft itself was well maintained, this underlying issue went undetected. Investigators then focused on the human factors. The captain had not participated in the pre-flight briefing and had ignored crucial emergency procedures. His late arrival meant that the crew had skipped vital coordination steps, including a discussion of engine failure procedures specific to Tamanrasset Airport. Cockpit recordings confirmed that the captain took control immediately after the failure without understanding the problem, while the first officer, who had been flying competently, was sidelined. The failure to communicate clearly and follow the crew resource management (CRM) protocols turned a manageable emergency into a fatal one. The presence of the purser in the cockpit during takeoff added another layer of distraction. The purser, normally responsible for cabin emergencies, should have been positioned to assist passengers and manage exits in case of evacuation. Instead, he remained in the cockpit, talking to the captain, contributing to lost situational awareness. Investigators emphasized that every error compounded the situation: high weight, high altitude, high temperature, delayed procedures, distracted crew, and one failed engine. Individually, each factor might have been manageable, but together, they created a perfect storm. The investigation into Air Algérie Flight 60 to 89 painted a clear picture. The crash was not caused by a single factor, but by a combination of mechanical failure and human error. The left engine failure during takeoff was catastrophic, but the aircraft could have been controlled if the standard procedures were followed. With the correct pitch angle, gear retracted, and full thrust on the right engine, a safe climb was theoretically possible even with one engine out. The captain's actions worsened the situation. By taking control without fully understanding the failure, he overrode the first officer, who was trained and ready to handle the engine loss. The lack of a proper handover and clear communication led to confusion and delayed corrective actions. Crew resource management (CRM) failures were also critical. The cockpit lacked coordination, focus, and adherence to procedures. The first officer tried to maintain control and call out warnings, but her input was ignored or unheard. Meanwhile, the purser's presence in the cockpit distracted the captain further and violated standard safety rules. Investigators concluded that pre-flight preparation was inadequate. The skipped emergency briefings and missed procedures meant the crew was mentally unprepared for a sudden engine failure, turning what could have been a manageable emergency into a fatal outcome. The weight of the aircraft, high-density altitude, and afternoon heat further reduced the aircraft's performance margins, leaving no room for errors once the engine failed. In just a few seconds, a sequence of small missteps escalated into a catastrophic chain reaction. This accident became a stark reminder of how mechanical issues are only one part of aviation safety. Human factors and discipline are equally critical. Following the tragic crash, investigators issued several key recommendations to prevent similar disasters in the future. First, there was a strong emphasis on crew resource management (CRM) training. Pilots needed to practice clear communication, proper handovers, and coordinated responses to emergencies. The accident showed that ignoring CRM, even for highly experienced crews, could quickly turn a controllable situation fatal. Second, there was a call for enhanced engine failure training. While pilots train for engine-out scenarios, the investigation revealed that procedures were not fully internalized or properly rehearsed at Tamanrasset Airport. Realistic simulator training emphasizing unusual but critical situations was recommended. Third, the airline was urged to implement a better flight safety monitoring program. Analyzing flight data can help detect dangerous trends, such as unusual engine wear, procedural deviations, or lapses in cockpit discipline, before they lead to an accident. Finally, investigators highlighted the importance of strict adherence to standard operating procedures. From pre-flight briefings to emergency protocols, these rules exist for a reason: to prevent chaos during critical moments. Deviating from them, even casually, can have catastrophic consequences. The tragedy of Flight 60-89 became a case study in aviation safety worldwide. It underscored the interdependence of technical reliability and human discipline. Even a well-maintained aircraft can crash if the crew is unprepared, distracted, or fails to communicate effectively. Most importantly, it reminded the aviation community that every role matters, from cockpit crew to cabin staff. One lapse at any level can trigger a sequence of events that no single pilot, no matter how skilled, can correct in time. Air Algérie Flight 60-89 remains a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly a routine flight can turn deadly when preparation and focus are ignored. The investigation made one thing abundantly clear: the crash was preventable. Mechanical failure alone did not cause the disaster. The left engine's sudden failure could have been managed if the crew had followed proper procedures, retracting the landing gear, maintaining correct pitch, and applying full thrust on the functioning engine. Instead, distractions, poor communication, and rushed actions created a cascade of errors. The lone survivor, the 28-year-old conscript, owed his life to sheer luck. Being unbelted during the crash, while dangerous in normal circumstances, allowed him to be ejected from the wreckage and survive. His survival was a stark contrast to the fate of the other 102 people on board. From this tragedy, the aviation industry learned the critical importance of strict adherence to standard operating procedures, proper pre-flight briefings and mental preparation, effective crew resource management, realistic emergency training for every scenario. Flight 60-89 is often cited in aviation safety programs as an example of how human error and poor decision-making can amplify mechanical failures. Even the smallest lapse, like a distracted captain or unbriefed procedures, can lead to disaster in seconds. Ultimately, this story serves as a reminder to respect every rule, every checklist, and every protocol in aviation. In the cockpit, there is no room for casual conversation or overlooked steps. Lives depend on it. On 20th August 2008, a routine holiday flight leaving Madrid almost became a story that never happened. Yet within hours, it would turn into one of Spain's deadliest aviation disasters. This is the tragic and deeply ironic story of Spanair Flight 5022, a crash that, in many ways, came painfully close to being avoided. That afternoon, 166 passengers and 6 crew members boarded a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 at Madrid Burgos Airport. Their destination was the sunny Canary Islands, just a 3-hour journey away. Most travelers were Spanish tourists escaping the August heat, while a handful came from Germany, Turkey, France, Italy, and other countries. At the controls sat Captain Antonio Garcia Luna, a 39-year-old former Air Force instructor known for his precision and strict attention to procedures. His first officer, 31-year-old Francisco Javier Mulet was far less experienced but equally dedicated, described by colleagues as disciplined, eager to learn, and deeply passionate about flying. The aircraft itself was a 15-year-old MD-82, a model once considered one of the safest and most reliable workhorses in commercial aviation. Nothing about this flight seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, if you watched the passengers boarding, you would never assume anything was wrong. But beneath the calm routine, a chain of events was quietly forming. A sequence of coincidences, small oversights, and hidden technical issues, each insignificant on its own, was about to align in the worst possible way. And it all began with the simplest of problems. A temperature reading that didn't look quite right. Just after 1:30 p.m., Spanair 5022 was cleared for takeoff from runway 36L. The MD-82 began rolling toward the runway threshold, engines humming normally. But only seconds before pushing the throttles forward, the pilots noticed something strange. The RAM air temperature probe, a sensor that measures the temperature of the air rushing past the aircraft, was showing an unusually high reading. On the surface, it seemed like a minor issue, just a number on a display. Yet this sensor feeds information to the auto-throttle system, which controls engine power during takeoff. If the reading suggests the air is extremely hot, the auto-throttle might reduce power automatically, believing the engines are at risk. That is the last thing a pilot wants during takeoff. Captain Garcia Luna immediately called the tower. Madrid, Spanair 5022, we have a slight problem. We need to exit the runway. They pulled off the runway and contacted the maintenance control center in Palma. The technicians suspected that the rat probe might simply be receiving an abnormal electrical current. They asked the crew to reset a circuit breaker, known as Z29, which powers the probe's heating element. The crew followed the instructions. But nothing changed. At this point, the aircraft was still perfectly safe to fly. The strange temperature reading had appeared on earlier flights and none had suffered any issues. But the crew didn't know that. Out of caution, ironically, the very caution meant to protect their flight, they taxied back to the gate for a closer inspection. In the rising summer heat, the cabin began to warm. Passengers grew restless. Technicians entered and exited the cockpit as they searched for a solution. Minutes turned into an hour. And with every passing moment, the pressure on the pilots increased. They wanted to leave. The passengers wanted to leave. Even the airline wanted them to leave. No one knew it, but the first link in a deadly chain had just been locked in place. Back at the gate, the maintenance team tried one idea after another to lower the abnormal temperature reading from the rat probe. They even discussed using dry ice to cool the sensor. The cockpit became a revolving door, technicians stepping in, the purser checking on the delay, and even an off-duty Spanair captain offering suggestions. Inside the aircraft, the temperature kept climbing. With the engines off and only limited cooling available, the cabin felt like a greenhouse. Passengers fanned themselves, whispering nervously. Everyone simply wanted the flight to get moving again. For Captain Garcia Luna and First Officer Mulet, this environment was becoming mentally exhausting. What had started as a simple precaution had now turned into more than an hour of troubleshooting. The captain knew passengers were frustrated, the flight was late, and the workload inside the cockpit had skyrocketed. Finally, maintenance proposed a solution. The crew could pull the circuit breaker to cut electrical power to the probe's heater entirely. The sensor would remain inoperative, but it wouldn't affect safety as long as no icing was expected. The captain agreed. Now the pilots had to start over, as if this were a brand new flight. They needed new clearance, new checklists, new preparations. But instead of taking a calm, methodical approach, the pressure of the delay pushed them into rushing. As refueling began, the captain left the cockpit to supervise it personally, eager to speed things up. Meanwhile, the first officer attempted to call air traffic control for a new route clearance but accidentally called the wrong frequency, an early sign that the mental strain was beginning to erode their usual discipline. This was the exact moment when the cockpit needed structure, patience, and strict adherence to procedures. Instead, distractions, heat, and stress began to blur the lines. And the cracks in their workflow, small at first, were starting to show. With the aircraft finally refueled and passengers growing impatient, the crew prepared once more for departure. But the tone inside the cockpit had changed completely. Instead of calm coordination, there was tension and haste. As they began the before-start checklist, the captain responded to items before the first officer even read them. This might seem harmless, but in aviation, it's a red flag. Checklists only work when both pilots move slowly and verify each step together. Rushing breaks the entire system. Still feeling the pressure, the captain called ATC again, something that was actually the first officer's responsibility. Little by little, their defined roles were blending together. The cockpit was losing structure, just when structure mattered most. Then came a critical moment. When the checklist reached the final item, flaps and slats, the captain interrupted the first officer, telling him to request taxi clearance instead. The distraction caused them to skip confirming flap settings entirely. The engines started. The aircraft began to taxi. But the flaps, essential for takeoff, remained at zero. This wasn't their only chance to catch the mistake. During the taxi checklist, an indicator light that should have been illuminated was dark, a warning sign that the slats were not configured. Neither pilot noticed. There was yet another opportunity, the takeoff briefing, a routine review that includes verifying flap settings. That, too, was skipped. Meanwhile, a flight attendant sat in the jump seat behind them, chatting about the earlier technical issue. Small talk right in the middle of critical procedures. The sterile cockpit rule, designed to prevent exactly this, had faded completely. As the aircraft approached the runway, the last gate of safety was closing. But the crew didn't know it. And soon, there would be only one system left to save them. As Spanner 5022 lined up on runway 36L for the second time, the crew performed their final checks. This was the takeoff imminent checklist, the absolute last chance to catch any configuration errors before the aircraft accelerated down the runway. The first officer reviewed the instruments aloud, center of gravity, power settings, and then he spoke the words investigators would later find chilling. Flaps 11. But the flaps were not at 11. They were still at 0, the default position, completely unsuitable for takeoff. Both the indicator screen and the physical flap wheel showed the correct reading. The mistake wasn't the instruments. It was the human brain. Investigators concluded that the first officer had fallen victim to expectation bias, a powerful psychological effect where people see what they expect to see, not what is really there. Under fatigue, heat, and time pressure, this bias grows even stronger. In that moment, the first officer read the instruments, but his mind supplied the value he anticipated. And the captain, focused outside the cockpit while aligning the plane with the runway, did not double-check. There was now only one layer of protection left. The takeoff warning system. A system specifically designed to scream at pilots if the aircraft is not properly configured for takeoff. It should have sounded the moment they pushed the throttles forward. But when takeoff power was applied, nothing happened. No alarm. No hold. No warning. The aircraft accelerated normally, gathering speed down the runway, the crew unaware that their MD-82 was attempting to lift off in a configuration that made safe flight almost impossible. Inside the cockpit, everything seemed routine. On the flight deck, the pilots believed they were moments away from climbing into the sky. But hidden beneath that calm, a deadly stall was already waiting. At 157 knots, the MD-82 finally left the ground. For a brief moment, everything looked normal. The wheels lifted, the aircraft began to climb, and then, within seconds, the illusion shattered. Almost instantly, the stall warning horn blared through the cockpit. The stick shaker activated, violently vibrating the control column. These alarms meant only one thing: the aircraft was flying far too slowly to remain in the air. Without flaps, the wings simply couldn't generate enough lift. The first officer, startled by the sudden warnings, thought an engine had failed. Acting on instinct, he briefly reduced throttle, which only worsened the situation. Realizing the mistake, he immediately slammed the throttles fully forward. But it was too late. The aircraft climbed only to about 40 feet, barely above the runway, before the nose pitched dangerously upward. The jet rolled 32 degrees to the right, fighting physics with every second. The captain shouted commands over the chaos. The first officer tried to correct the roll. But with the wings starving for lift, the MD-82 began to sink. The aircraft dropped tail first, smashing into the ground just beyond the runway. It slid violently across the terrain, tearing through an embankment and breaking apart as fuel ignited into a massive fireball. From liftoff to impact, the entire sequence lasted about 10 seconds. Inside the airport, people heard the explosion. Black smoke curled into the sky. Emergency crews rushed toward the burning wreckage, a twisted field of metal and flames. Out of 172 people on board, only 18 survived. In just moments, a flight that had been delayed, frustrated, and pressured into departing had become Spain's worst aviation disaster in a quarter of a century. But while the crash was over, the real investigation, the search for deeper answers, was only beginning. In the aftermath of the crash, Spain launched a full investigation through the Civil Aviation Accident and Incident Investigation Commission. At first glance, the cause seemed obvious. The crew forgot to set the flaps. But investigators quickly realized that this explanation barely scratched the surface. The forgotten flaps were not the root of the disaster, they were the final outcome of a deeper chain of failures. The first question investigators asked was simple. Why were the flaps never deployed? They reviewed the cockpit voice recorder and discovered the troubling truth. The crew had rushed through multiple checklists, skipped essential steps, and repeatedly allowed distractions into the cockpit. The sterile cockpit rule, meant to keep conversation strictly professional during critical moments, had completely dissolved. However, investigators also asked an even more important question. Why didn't the takeoff warning system save them? This system existed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of accident. Had it worked, it would have blasted a loud alarm the moment takeoff power was applied. The crew would have stopped immediately. But the system stayed silent. Investigators examined the aircraft for days, testing relays, switches, wiring, and every component linked to the rat probe and the toes. The strange part was that the rat probe and the toes were powered through the same electrical relay. If the relay failed, it could explain both the faulty temperature reading and the silent warning system. This possibility had been seen before. Boeing reported at least 6 cases where MD-80 aircraft experienced both a high rat temperature and a failed toes test. In 4 of those cases, replacing the relay fixed the problem. But in the crash of Flight 5022, no definitive failure was found. The result was unsettling. The toes might have failed because of the same issue that caused the rat problem, or it might have failed for a reason no one could determine. With no clear answer on the system failure, the investigation pushed deeper into pilot performance, psychology, training, and airline procedures. The real truth, they realized, was far more complex than a simple oversight. As investigators dug deeper, a clearer picture began to form. The disaster wasn't the result of a single mistake, it was the outcome of multiple human factor failures stacking together. One of the most significant issues was time pressure. The moment the crew returned to the gate, they unintentionally placed themselves under a psychological countdown. The growing delay, the heat inside the cabin, the restless passengers, and the long wait for maintenance all combined to create an atmosphere of stress and urgency. Under these conditions, even experienced pilots can become vulnerable. The captain, usually described as methodical and disciplined, began showing signs of tunnel vision. He rushed through checklists, spoke over the first officer, and even handled radio calls himself. This broke the principle of clearly divided cockpit roles, a fundamental defense against errors. The first officer, meanwhile, was affected by expectation bias. After more than an hour of troubleshooting, he mentally assumed everything had been configured normally. So when he looked at the flap indicators, his brain essentially filled in the value he expected to see. Another issue investigators highlighted was the breakdown of crew resource management, or CRM. CRM is designed to ensure that both pilots monitor each other, challenge mistakes, and maintain situational awareness. But on Flight 5022, CRM slowly eroded. The cockpit became distracted with off-topic conversation. The sterile cockpit rule was ignored. And with roles blurring, nobody was fully monitoring the aircraft's configuration. Investigators concluded that the crash was the result of a cascading series of human errors, each one small on its own, but together forming a deadly chain. Rushed procedures. Skipped checklist items. Expectation bias. Communication breakdown. Lack of monitoring. Distractions inside the cockpit. Any one of these could have been caught. But under stress, each barrier fell, one after another. And ultimately, a plane that had been perfectly airworthy just hours earlier was lost because of a combination of pressure, distraction, and human limits. The storm outside had finally begun to weaken, but inside the crashed aircraft, fear was still sitting heavily in the air. Ehsan looked around at the survivors huddled near the broken seats, their faces pale, their clothes soaked, their eyes begging for hope. For a moment, he closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "If we lose calm now, we lose everything." Just then, a strange sound echoed from the back of the plane, metal shifting, something cracking. Sufyan immediately stood up. "Everyone stay where you are," he said firmly. "Ehsan, come with me." The two slowly walked toward the noise. Their footsteps echoed in the empty, damaged aisle. The wind howled through the torn fuselage as if warning them of something darker waiting ahead. When they reached the rear section, they froze. The support beam, the only thing holding up the collapsed tail of the aircraft, was bending slowly. If it snapped, the entire back portion of the plane would crush the survivors sitting near the middle. Ehsan's heart dropped. "We don't have much time," he whispered. Sufyan tapped his shoulder. "We have to move them. Right now." Both men rushed back to the front. Ehsan shouted loudly, louder than the storm itself. "Everyone get up. Move to the left side. Don't panic, just move." The survivors stood immediately. Some limped, some held each other, some cried, but they moved. They trusted Ehsan's voice more than their own fear. Just as the last woman stepped aside, crack! The support beam snapped. The entire tail section dropped several feet with a deafening crash, sending dust and debris flying everywhere. If they had been even 10 seconds late, half the survivors would have been crushed. Ehsan looked at Sufyan, breath shaking. That was too close. But Sufyan shook his head. No. That was a warning. This plane won't stay standing for long. Everyone stared at the damaged wreckage. Ehsan knew Sufyan was right. The real fight for survival was just beginning. The official report on Spanair Flight 5022 painted a devastating but clear picture. This crash wasn't just a pilot error. It was a cascade of small failures, amplified by stress, distraction, and hidden technical problems. The flaps were never set, the takeoff warning system remained silent, and expectation bias tricked the first officer into seeing what he expected rather than what was real. Investigators identified several critical lessons for aviation worldwide. Airlines were urged to strengthen crew resource management, ensuring that pilots clearly divide responsibilities, adhere strictly to checklists, and maintain a sterile cockpit during critical phases. Mandatory training on takeoff stall recovery was emphasized to prevent similar accidents. And aircraft manufacturers were instructed to redesign systems like TOS, so a single fault could no longer disable these last lines of defense. The crash also highlighted the dangers of psychological pressure. Even highly experienced pilots can make fatal errors when rushed, stressed, or distracted. Spanair Flight 5022 became a case study for the aviation community, a haunting reminder that safety depends not just on machines or experience, but on human factors as well. Of the 172 people on board, only 18 survived. Their lives carried the weight of unimaginable trauma, but also the lessons that would shape aviation safety for years to come. Spanair Flight 5022 is a story of tragic coincidences, ironies, and small decisions spiraling into disaster. It reminds us that safety is fragile, and vigilance, discipline, and teamwork are not optional, they are essential. In the end, it is a story of loss, but also a story of how tragedy can drive change and save countless lives in the future. On the night of 23 August 2001, an Air Transat Airbus A330 prepared for a routine journey from Toronto to Lisbon. To the hundreds of passengers boarding the aircraft, it was just another long overnight flight across the Atlantic, nothing more. Families, tourists, and Portuguese nationals returning home settled into their seats, unaware that they were stepping into one of the most extraordinary survival stories in modern aviation. The aircraft itself was practically new, only 2 years old, and considered one of the safest, most advanced jets of its time. Packed with sensors, computers, and layered safety systems, the A330 was designed to handle almost anything. No one suspected that deep inside one of its engines, a tiny overlooked detail would set the stage for disaster. In the cockpit sat Captain Robert Peche, a highly experienced Canadian pilot with more than 16,000 hours in the air. Alongside him was First Officer Dirk Dejaga, a younger pilot but skilled and trusted. Together, they expected an uneventful 7-hour crossing. After loading nearly 48 tons of fuel, the aircraft lifted off into the night sky, climbing smoothly toward its cruising altitude. For several hours everything was calm, the kind of quiet, steady cruise pilots usually appreciate. Passengers slept, cabin lights dimmed, and the vast Atlantic stretched below like endless darkness. But 4 hours into the flight, an unexpected message appeared on the cockpit displays. Engine 2, the right engine, was showing a strange combination of readings: high oil pressure, low oil quantity, and unusually low oil temperature. It made no sense. The manuals gave no clear explanation, and the pilots had never seen these numbers together before. They contacted Air Transat's maintenance center for advice. While they waited for a response, the mysterious warnings continued. While the maintenance team in Canada searched for answers, everything inside the cabin still seemed completely normal. Most passengers were asleep, unaware that the first signs of trouble had appeared. In the cockpit, however, the situation slowly grew more puzzling. About 30 minutes after the strange oil warnings, another alert appeared, this time on the fuel display. The A330 showed a noticeable fuel imbalance between the left and right wing tanks. This was unusual, but not alarming by itself. Fuel imbalances happen, and the fix is simple: allow fuel to move from one side to the other. The pilots opened the crossfeed valve, expecting the numbers to stabilize. But just 10 minutes later, a far more disturbing message popped up: the total fuel remaining was suddenly much lower than expected. According to the flight plan, they should have had plenty of fuel left to reach Lisbon, but the gauges now showed dangerously low levels. Something didn't add up. Halfway across the Atlantic, the options were extremely limited. There were no nearby airports, just endless ocean. The only possible place to divert was Lajes Airport in the Azores, a remote island chain in the middle of the Atlantic. The crew immediately set course toward it and informed air traffic control that they were diverting due to a suspected fuel problem. But deep down, both pilots struggled to believe the readings. The drop in fuel was so extreme, like a ton every few minutes, that it seemed impossible. There had been no turbulence, no damage, no sign of anything that could cause a sudden fuel leak. And when cabin crew checked the wings and engines from the windows, they saw nothing leaking. Fueled by these observations, the pilots convinced themselves the instruments were malfunctioning. Modern jets often show false warnings, they thought. Why would a nearly new A330 suddenly start losing fuel at such a monstrous rate? This moment, this assumption, would shape everything that followed. As the aircraft turned toward the Azores, the fuel numbers continued to fall at an alarming pace. The pilots contacted Air Transat's maintenance control center again, hoping for clarification. They reported the strange readings: fuel vanishing far faster than any normal consumption rate. By this point, the plane showed only 4.8 tons of fuel, when it should have had more than triple that amount. Yet the idea of a massive leak still felt impossible to the crew. Fuel leaks on commercial aircraft are incredibly rare, and neither pilot had ever dealt with one in training. Worse, their minds were already fixed on the earlier assumption that all warnings were caused by faulty sensors. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, when people cling to their first explanation and unconsciously filter out anything that contradicts it. Even as evidence piled up, the pilots viewed it through the lens of "the gauges must be wrong." They briefly discussed the official fuel leak checklist but chose not to follow it. One step required a descent to 20,000 feet, something the captain believed was far too risky. If they really were losing fuel, dropping altitude would only shorten their remaining time in the air. Staying high meant more gliding distance if the worst happened. This decision was shaped by another psychological pattern known as framing. Faced with two bad options, a guaranteed disadvantage versus a possible disaster, people tend to choose the risky option in the hope the worst won't happen. But time was running out. At 6:13 a.m., the right engine suddenly shut down. The crew's doubts vanished instantly. This was no instrument error. Something was terribly wrong. The captain pushed the remaining engine to maximum power and began an emergency descent. With only one engine running and almost no fuel left, the race to reach the Azores had truly begun. With the right engine gone, the cockpit instantly shifted from uncertainty to full-scale emergency. The first officer radioed air traffic control, declaring they had suffered an engine failure and were descending. The captain focused on squeezing every remaining mile out of the single operating engine. But their situation was even worse than they realized. The fuel gauges showed almost nothing left, barely 600 kilograms, an amount that could disappear in minutes. And they were still more than 240 kilometers from the Azores. 13 minutes later, the nightmare reached its peak. The left engine flamed out. The Airbus A330, one of the most advanced jets of its time, had turned into a powerless glider over the Black Atlantic. Without engine power, most electrical systems went dark. Emergency lights flickered. The cabin fell silent, apart from the rustle of panicked breathing. The Ramer turbine automatically deployed beneath the aircraft, generating just enough electricity to keep a few essential instruments alive. It was a lifeline, but a fragile one. Inside the cabin, the sudden loss of pressurization caused the oxygen masks to fall. Passengers jolted awake to the terrifying sight of a pitch-black cabin, no engine noise, and glowing yellow masks swaying above their heads. Flight attendants rushed to calm everyone, though many of them were just as shaken. The captain informed the crew to prepare for the unthinkable, a ditching in the ocean. At night, in heavy Atlantic swells, it would almost certainly be fatal. The crew knew it. The pilots knew it. Even the passengers could sense it. But Captain Piche refused to accept that outcome. They were still around 100 kilometers from land. The A330 descended at roughly 2,000 feet per minute, giving them about 15 minutes before hitting the surface, water or runway. If they were going to survive, he had to glide this heavy, partially crippled aircraft all the way to Lajes airfield. As the powerless jet continued its silent descent, the captain kept his eyes locked on the faint cluster of runway lights far ahead, Lajes Airport, the only strip of land that could save them. Between the aircraft and that runway lay more than 60 miles of darkness and no room for mistakes. Without engine power, the A330 had lost 2 of its 3 hydraulic systems. This meant the controls felt heavier, the stabilizer on the tail responded sluggishly, and most wing spoilers were unusable. Even the nosewheel steering and thrust reversers, critical for landing, were gone. Every movement required precision and instinct. Inside the cabin, the mood had shifted from fear to a quiet, tense acceptance. The crew instructed passengers to rehearse the brace position, though no one knew if they'd meet the ocean or the runway first. Every second mattered. The captain had to maintain a delicate balance. Above 140 knots, or the ram air turbine would stop producing power. Below 200 knots, or the landing gear might fail to lock into place. The only way to manage speed without engines was by adjusting the aircraft's pitch, nose up to slow, nose down to accelerate. As the jet drifted closer to the Azores, air traffic control flashed the runway lights repeatedly, hoping to guide the crew. That distant glow was the single point of hope in an otherwise black horizon. However, a new problem appeared. The captain realized he had been too successful at staying high. 8 miles from the runway, the plane was at 13,000 feet, far above the normal approach altitude. A steep dive would overspeed the aircraft, making a safe landing impossible. So he made a risky decision: turn away from the runway. He began a full 360-degree turn, using the wide arc to bleed altitude. Half of that turn pointed the aircraft away from safety, a nerve-wracking maneuver with no engines to recover lost height. But it was the only chance to line up properly. During the turn, the first officer extended the slats to generate extra lift and lowered the landing gear, a move that added drag but was necessary for touchdown. Every second in that turn felt like a lifetime. If they lost just a bit too much altitude, they would fall short into the ocean. As the Airbus rolled out of the 360-degree turn, the captain's heart clenched. The runway finally aligned straight ahead, but the sight was terrifying. They were still too high, still too fast, and running out of sky. The altimeter unwound like a clock with its springs broken. 10,000 feet. 9,000. 8,000 dropping fast, but not fast enough. The aircraft needed to meet the runway at a shallow angle, yet they were gliding in like a stone skipping across water. Inside the cockpit, the first officer called out the numbers, his voice steady but pale. Speed 230 knots, altitude 7,200. The captain's mind was a battlefield of calculations. Every second forced a new decision. He pushed the nose down slightly, letting gravity pull them harder, but not so hard that they would lose control. Without engines to stabilize the descent, every movement felt like walking on thin ice. The cabin lights flickered, the ram air turbine was at its limits. If it stopped spinning, they would lose the last of their hydraulics. The aircraft would become a 200-ton glider with no control. Keep us above 140 knots, the captain reminded himself under his breath. Behind the cockpit door, passengers were gripping seatbacks, hands, prayers, anything to hold on to. Some had their eyes closed, some wide open. The cabin crew stood braced, watching for the slightest cue from the flight deck. The ocean below looked like a sheet of black glass, waiting for whatever came next. At 5,000 feet, the aircraft was still high for a proper landing. The captain selected full flaps, what little control they still had adding drag, forcing the aircraft to sink faster. A harsh vibration ran through the jet. Flaps at low power were never meant to be deployed in a powerless glide. But they held. Runway in sight, the first officer announced, though both men had been staring at it for the last minute, its lights glowing like a thin, fragile lifeline stretched across the island. 4,000 feet. 3,500. Still too high. Still too high. The captain made another bold call. We'll go for a shallow S-turn. Just enough to drop the altitude, no more. A dangerous maneuver this close to the ground. One wrong move and they could stall, roll, and spiral into the ocean. He banked left just a little. Then right. Each turn shading a slice of altitude without losing precious forward speed. The aircraft trembled but obeyed. As they leveled out, largest runway 33 lined up perfectly ahead. Altitude 1,900 feet. Distance less than 2 miles. They had one shot. With almost no hydraulics, no thrust reversers, no steering, and no second attempt possible. This landing would decide everything. The captain tightened his grip on the controls. Brace, 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 brace for landing, the cabin crew shouted behind them. The runway rushed toward them like a silver blade through the dark. It was time. The A330 crossed the shoreline barely 600 feet above the ground. The captain lowered the nose gently, aiming for the first third of the runway. Too far in, they would overshoot. Too short, and they'd hit the rocks. Speed 165 knots, the first officer called out. Still fast. But no choice. With no thrust reversers and almost no hydraulic pressure, they needed every inch of runway. The ground rose sharply to meet them. 50. 40. 30. The captain pulled back slightly, just enough. 20. 10. The wheels slammed onto the runway with a violent bang. Not a landing, an impact. The aircraft bounced once, then crashed down again. The left landing gear groaned, shaking the whole fuselage. Sparks flashed under the wings as the crew deployed whatever spoilers still worked. Without nose-wheel steering, the captain fought the drifting aircraft using only rudder pressure and instinct. The jet veered right. He countered. It swerved left. He countered again. The brakes barely responded. The speed stayed dangerously high. Come on, he whispered through clenched teeth. The end of the runway approached, a dark wall beyond the lights. Finally, the last hydraulic pressure bit into the brakes. The aircraft screeched, shuddered, and finally slowed. Then stopped. Total silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the faint wail of emergency alarms. Then crying. Then laughter. Then applause exploding through the cabin as passengers realized they were alive. The captain exhaled for the first time in minutes. He looked at the runway lights ahead, the lights that had guided them through 60 miles of darkness. They had made the impossible glide. They had saved every soul on board. And the night over the Azores finally felt alive again.